Bem-vindos ao painel.
Hello, hello. Welcome to this panel about the schools. I am Leandra Duarte. I am white. I have long hair and blonde. Behind me, I have a shelf with books. And today, we're going to talk about LGBT children and the role of schools to combat prejudice. So, this is an initiative from the Government of Canada together with the Association of LGBT in São Paulo, the Government of France, and support from Aliança Francesa. And today we have the support of Irina in the sign language and Prisma uh, in the simultaneous translation in English, Portuguese, French, and Spanish. We have a sociologist from the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul, Jasmine Roy, actor and president of the Jasmine Roy entity in Canada. We also have from the Civil Society, FDA in Argentina. Welcome, all of you. And I'm going to start this conversation with Fernando. So the increase in the number of children who take on their LGBT character has been growing exponentially over the last few years. As a result, the number of cases of pride has also increased. So how can schools fight against this discrimination? Fernando, thank you. Thank you for the invitation, Leandra. And let me just turn this off while I speak. And the subjects that we're going to talk about today, they're so difficult. And, you know, we need people from other countries, people from the academic world, and the situation that you talked about, Leandra, this increase in the number of denouncing of cases of school violence against the gay and lesbian, transvestite and transsexual population. It is absolutely correct. Yes, according to surveys, it is present in other countries. And I'm going to talk about the Brazilian case. So in the Brazilian case, we have to take into consideration that until a few years ago, and I think we can say very clearly maybe the year 2000, transvestites, and transsexuals, and lesbians and gays, they did not go through these problems because they were expelled from the school before this happened, right at the beginning. So, starting in 1995, as a result of the Federal Constitution of 1988 in Brazil, we have these numbers that make us proud of 98% of the population at school going to school, of school age going to school. And I know that the countries that are represented here, these numbers were achieved in some cases in the previous century before that. In the case of Brazil, definitely they were expelled from school. So the Black people, women in general, gays, lesbians, transvestites, and transsexuals. So your question, Leandra, talks about a double movement. First of all, violence that this population suffered when you were already outside the school, when you were in secondary school, between 15 and 18 years of age. In Brazil, we call it ensino médio. And today, they are inside the school. So I think this brings two signs. First of all, I am optimistic, according to the surveys that I do of ethnography and scenes of school life in the public schools in the metropolitan region of Porto Alegre. They show that effectively gays and young transvestites and transsexuals and lesbians, today they can be found in the schools in an appropriate area to protest against these episodes of violence. So this has been growing exponentially. At the same time in Brazil, there's the conservative reactionary and authoritarian, I'm going to put the best adjectives, fascist I am not afraid of using this expression. It comes with these movements that we know as gender ideologies, schools without parties, the issue of prohibition of neutral languages at school, which is very important for people, and programs with interesting names, so schools without pedophilia, and they cause an increased tension and promote more violence. I'm at the end of my time, and I summarize this saying that these processes also happen in other countries in Latin America, but in Brazil, we have particular characteristics because of our delayed issue of inclusion at school. And I'm very optimistic as well because they happen because these populations are at school. They want to stay at school. They want to go to university through the quotas, and they are protesting. So, without being too optimistic, this is my position. Thank you. Thank you. So, it's not only about going into these spaces, it's remaining in these places as well, right? In the community. Okay, the next speaker is going to be Jasmine Roy. Good morning, everyone. And my name is is actually pronounced Jasmine, and I'm very happy to be here. And in 2010, I started my foundation, and we work a lot to create data and launch many studies about this reality. And we, when it's possible, we talk about the coming out, and I'm talking about Canada and Quebec because each province in Canada has its own educational um, institutions. Now, we cannot say that the cases have gone up. Even before the pandemic, there was a lowering in the number of cases. The insults that are found the most in these cases. So there's a whole movement to try and socialize these people. And we started in the systemic profiles. So homophobia is a systemic problem. We have to review the system, and we've looked at several forms of doing it. We also convinced the government to implement an action plan where you could integrate the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of the Family, the Ministry of Health, and also the ministry that has to do with social programs for a transversal collaboration. So we had a recurrent problem that still exists, but we noticed a different trend. So we noticed that we had to have a strategy. So first evaluate what was happening in the field. In 2010, 80% of the schools implemented strategies to fight against discrimination. However, they had not done any kind of evaluation about this. So we would intervene. We organized spontaneous activities, but we know that the spontaneous activities, they do not develop social conduct in the school, social behaviors, and that's not enough. You need to integrate this into the curriculum of the schools. And also what we decided was to make this move forward. We talked about emotional competence, development in young people, about the sexual setting, and we talked about sexual and gender identity. And we tried to have a different sort of approach according to the development of competencies. So I communicate with these people, and we have tools for small children who are exploring their gender identity. And as a person dealing with this child, how can I communicate with a child? How can I respect their limits and listen to their needs and follow them up? In general, when we talk about this approach, Our approach is positive and benevolent, and we need to talk about, transphobia and homophobia. But we notice that sometimes this brought the opposite effect, only doing that. So as adults, we are investing in modernizing certain behaviors. So as an adult, I don't accept several behaviors. And when we talk about integration, it is to intervene when you're talking about behaviors that should be punished. So we punish the young people, but it's not enough time to teach them the adequate behavior. So it sort of reinforces this sort of behavior. So what we should do is look at how I would like to address these people and this person. We know that violence many times is an emotional problem. So it was necessary to have education in terms of this approach, which is what we do here in Quebec.
And then didático, sempre
Great. That was very didactic, always education, always education. Okay, I'd like to invite Andre Rivas to answer my question.
¿Qué tal a todos? Buenas tardes.
How are you? Good afternoon.
Bueno, yo también agradecer mucho el
Good afternoon to all those who are with us. And I'd like to thank you for the invitation to be here on such an important day like today. And we reaffirm the fight that must be continuous against hate, discrimination against LGBT, and definitely at school. This is where we're going to see that there's still a long way to go. And I believe that one of the issues that we have to know about is to understand the urgency that because the LGBT and the children of LGBT parents and we are violating their rights. And what I have noticed is that especially in the work that we've been doing at school, we can see a lack of awareness and that there is something urgent, that there is violation of human rights, and it is happening systematically. And every time that we allow a child, an LGBT child, to be a victim. So, there are barriers that exist in education so that this child can have the same opportunities and the same safety. So we're not working in an urgent manner, taking into account the possibilities. It is a violation of human rights, and in a world like today, what I was telling Jasmine, and something that is very important in Argentina, integrated sexual education. There's a law that is more than 15 years old. And in fact, we did some research a few years ago, and it does not have a high reliability in sexual activity. And it is more focused. And there are different phases that we go through. And that's for sexual relationships. And there's a reason for this. So we set aside what we consider to be integrated sexual education as a human right that has already been mentioned in the United States at UNESCO. And there's the effective part, the part that has to do with people's diversity. So there's access to several other rights, such as health and trans integral health and gender identity and harassment, autonomy, the progressive autonomy of children, and the law in Argentina. And it allows, there's an article that allows all the population, it's according to how the members of this community think about, that allow this education to reach the rural schools. And in the territory, what we have in Argentina, we have a great contrast, and the implementation of the laws and to be able to have access to these rights, it's just very difficult. And people, the LGBT people, it's exactly something that we have today. It led to finding the making of programs to protect the boys and girls, all the kids inside the reality of the communities, because the abandoning and of school and violence that happens, lack of prevention of this sort of violence. And there's very basic things. So they're not thinking about access to the bathroom, for example, safe access to the bathroom. So that is discriminatory. Let me give you an example. So I think that to close, I think it's very important to work with urgency and to work with this consciousness that it is about violation of human rights and expression of hatred. And the children, the LGBTQA plus, and the experience of hate and discrimination that comes around in our adolescents, and people are not prepared to be able to prevent anything, because I think that prevention is something that, you don't even talk about this. So we have to work on prevention of this sort of structural violence that is really naturalized. So make effective plans to stop them. And this should be an objective. And afterwards, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've been working on in the Canadian Embassy and in Argentina. And we also work a lot with them. And they talked about the desire of children, of changing their realities in other places, and also in receiving help from the institutions. And that was very difficult. So the idea of preventing violence, it is about human rights and it is urgent. Thank you. Thank you very much for your contribution. And now we're going to hear Victor Rocha. He's also going to answer this question with his contribution. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Leandra. And I'm going to get a few ideas that have already been presented. And what Andrea and Jasmine and Fernando said. And I think we are in the process. And I think that it's very symbolic to have this context in the day on the day we are and thinking about the school, which is key to children's experience. And as a professor, I am also in this location. I work in a place of education, which is key. And how can we deal with this situation? So I'm going to talk about these elements that are very important. I'm going to talk a little bit about the experience in Chile. So we have the need of having policies that are updated and they become concrete and increasingly concrete, and moments that have to do with the political positions of the countries. In Chile, we have guidance from the Ministry of Education, number 17, article number 17. And after looking at the urgency, and now we have a more conservative government, and now they're not really talking about an urgency, but this should be an urgency, and there should be support of the families, students, and also the teachers. And I'm talking about this category. So we have the intention and we feel the need of generating these spaces. We don't talk about these tools and the spaces inside the school. It is basically mediated by situations that are bound to the urgent situations. And these topics only appear if you have to face a particular situation in some situation, but there's no policy about it in the schools, generating this sort of work as something constant. Since we notice that the rights and the element parts, they involve daily work inside the school. And many times this is overwhelming in other areas because we don't have an institutional kind of support. And in the education of teachers, I think that's also important. And the need to generate data that has to do with the communities that have access to this information. And I think that in Chile, we had a survey done in 2016, and 60% of the boys and girls who were interviewed, they did not feel safe. And that was a great warning for us. But after that, not a lot was done. So we haven't had updates since the pandemic, because that means going back after the pandemic, right? Going back to being personally present and what to do in this situation as well. So we have a topic of how to generate the data, and this data can be used, and also to consider the circulation and how we're going to do this. Now, another important thing is, it's today this was put in evidence, the need of understanding not only the what happens in the schools. I think that's a challenge, and it allows us to understand that the learning process is a follow-up process, and it generates spaces that involve the universe of support. And it's not only the transmission of knowledge, and it is a place where you create experiences. And we are in a process. We are only placing this great challenge, and the teachers that are in the school were generating a place to install this. And it's not only politicians that we want. It's a kind of obligation that we will have to work on some pedagogical practice. And we know that the school is a reproduction of society. At the national level, we have a lot of violence, and the students are accustomed to living in a school with expressions of hate. And this is how the school is transformed into a safe place. And I think it's necessary to go back to the school and check how this is done and have these public policies made in the school as well, so that there will be tools. So I think that it has to do with an experience for teachers, and many times when you receive the transition, you receive a child in transition and you don't really know how to welcome that child or how you should do it. So you also have the topic of how we do it, how we make this sort of articulation that includes all of the actors, all of the players, and also trying to think about the educational issues that the teachers are part of.
Muito obrigada pela contribuição de
Thank you very much for your contribution. So in our conversation, I would like to thank everyone for joining, people who are joining online. So please pay attention to your response time so that everybody can contribute in the best way possible. So now let's go to the second question. What is the greatest challenge between parents, children, and the pedagogical body to advance in the combat against prejudice? And the first person to answer this question is Andrea Rivas. Thank you. Well, I am going to talk about the program that we did with the support of the Canadian Embassy. And this is about children, these LGBT, QA+, and this is from Argentina, and this was and in the rural communities as well, and the semi-urbanized areas that will have schools where there's not really great possibilities of the information getting there. And this is unknown. And as the teachers and the communities saw, sometimes there's a lot of will of, doing the follow-up, but they don't have enough. We don't have enough support. So it's not enough in terms of what is a tool when we talk about contention networks. And in a school community, what it meant when being in a hate situation with a child, a gender child or an abuse, and people who were in the school, there was something adequate for a solution that takes into account the interest of the children, their well-being and their autonomy, because one of the challenges we still have is that we have a culture that is egocentric and they are progressive. And then we have the progressive autonomy that is coming in. And basically, this is what we notice. And that has to do with what has to help in the investigation and the abuse. We have a little bit of a technical problem. Can you tell me if everything is okay?
Vamos lá. Produção, podemos continuar? Tem
Continúa
2
entonces.
idiomas vazando.
Termino
Arrasou, podemos
para...
continuar.
¿Sí? ¿Continúo?
Sim, sim,
Should I
pode.
continue?
Gracias. Bueno,
Let's continue.
uno de los mayores desafíos que dije que nos
So one of the
enfrentamos
great
es
challenges that we have
las instituciones, no solo de la escuela, sino de
was the lack of
escuela en casos de cuando hay algún
things in the school and those who
violación de
should
derechos
support the
humanos,
school in some kind of violation of human rights,
la autonomía
where you should take into account the autonomy of the children. And as a result, let me give you an example just to make it clearer, because sometimes we talk about the culture in a practical manner, but what we see, for example, is that there's a child, a girl had gotten close to one of the teachers, talking about some kind of abuse she suffered at home because she was bisexual, and the violence that she was receiving and abuse as well. And the teacher called the police, and the situation ended up well, the child did not go to school anymore. That was the end of the story. It was in a rural school in Argentina. And with this program, we are able to follow up the teacher and the school so that we can, first of all, identify the protocols that should be followed and where they should go so that another institution would solve the problem, maybe the public ministry, so that they could follow up this. And there are many issues in these locations, these rural locations. And sometimes these institutional tools are enough, or in this case, I'm not saying it's corruption, but there is institutional violence that is organized, even in cultural issues, how the children belong to families. So there are issues in terms of human rights violations and that have the diversity of these challenges. And the greatest challenge that we have, we wanted to use these tools with the children of all ages and also with the families. So it was a surprise for us, but we should continue to work also in terms of trying to broaden the way that the protocols that existed or that were taken into consideration were efficient to really be able to solve the violence and stop the violence with regard to these children. And something that is very beautiful that surprised me that we used to do. We used to do this in a hybrid manner. We recorded this with people who were also present. And it overcame our expectations, the number of children that called us for consultations. And we noticed that there was the need to talk because we didn't have a space to talk. So there is the need to talk about these topics and deal with them. So this is something that happens frequently. And in fact, the children who have the opportunity, they speak, and this is what happens in the university, in the communities. So we really need to, as Victor has already said, we need to have this priority. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. There was a lot of learning. So the next person to speak is Victor Rocha. He's going to answer my question. Victor, over to you. So to talk about the experience of André Thank you for talking about this because it's not only in these communities. And I'm going to go beyond that. I'm going to talk about the teachers. And this is exactly where I work. And I'd like to understand that the teachers also receive a sort of education and also thinking about human rights and the need to integrate this sort of practice in the paradigm of human rights. And this involves pedagogical practices in society and also needs, because the state always needs something, in Latin America. It's the communities and those who have more powers and everyone who faces this. And so it's also important to consider the autonomy of the educational communities and the autonomy of the children. So I think that we also have to think about it and looking at the policies that ensure this sort of support. I think it's very important. And we are, alone with the teachers and with the parents look for a solution. But many times the support, the medical centers, social centers, psychological centers that are important in the construction of a network, sometimes they don't talk to the communities. And we face some barriers, access and the opportunity of access. That's all part of it. And that's how we don't have enough tools. That's how we see that. And then access to this multiple support, different kinds of support. It's not only reducing this to services, considering a single situation, it's supporting the educational entities, intervention on behalf of the children who are part of the community, and not only centralizing a specific type of child and a specific process, but support with regard to the community as well. So the parents of these children, they're going to feel more supported. And many times we're talking about fear and trying to find support that they couldn't find. Sometimes it's not good enough. And we have to understand that the support must be multiple. And many times, as teachers, we have the interest, we have the will, but we have a lack of policies, or we just need other institutions or support networks that many times remain in the administrative area. And this is blocked in bureaucratic management. And as teachers, we face this challenge of living with the situation. So violence inside the school and support, and we don't really have the tools that are necessary for support. And many times the schools do not generate these spaces to be able to put these support networks. So I believe that this is also the topic of access to the rights that are going to provide opportunities and in the network. And this is going to allow us to have parents who feel supported, and the community is going to be supported in the work from a process in the university and so on. And when the community feels supported, it's very interesting to generate practices amongst educational um, entities that will work on this, and this will be incorporated in the policy. And it's not only, a will, it's not only the institution, but to learn. So many times what happens to us as teachers is that we see another teacher in the sense of how they incorporated all of this. So many times that's part of the need to generate this network inside. And that would be interesting as well, because then there is a practice and there is knowledge that is important. not only with the institutions, but with the community to face all kinds of challenges that are constituted in the children's schools.
Muito obrigada, Victor. Olha,
Thank you very much, Victor.
dizer que é muito difícil.
I'm going to say that it's really very difficult to mediate this table because the debates, you know, it's just very difficult. And I just feel crazy, about the time. So I hope I will exchange ideas with you after this conversation. So now I'm going to call Fernando to make his contribution. So give us your name. You're representing Brazil. Thank you very much. Thank you, Leandra. So I'm talking about Brazil and from Porto Alegre, the capital of Rio Grande do Sul. And so this region of conflicts between families, parents, and young people in school. So in Brazil, this is a declared war. If I were not participating in the panel now, I would be looking at my social media because there's another attempt to approve the legislation recognized as homeschooling. And I prefer to call it domestic education because it's clearly the attempt to tame the schooling by families. I don't want to say anything against the families. I have my own family. I have 2 kids and I'm gay, but it's not about this. But the idea that the school has an autonomy, just like the families do, just like religious institutions do. So it comes in this government. It has been constantly attacked. And it says that the families actually can go against what is done at school. I'm against this. And I'm going to give you 2 examples because I have participated in a group that mediates families and schools here in Porto Alegre. And it's a very common case. For example, a young boy in primary school, he's called Joseph, and he wants to start being called Daisy. And according to our legislation, just like in previous governments, and it's part of this government as well, this child has the right, ensured by the school, the right to education and to have that name. And if that is bothersome, we have to call them according to the names that they entered the school. So it's really very difficult to be part of this mediation between a family and some teachers. And the family tells us that that child that was registered as Joseph, how will he be called the female name, Daisy, that he chose? It's very difficult for the school, and the school has been attacked. It's very difficult for us to say clearly that, yes, considering the school, inside the school, if that's how he feels more comfortable, he has the right to be called Daisy and have his name changed to a social name. So in Brazil, in the current government, the laws are always a matter of dispute. So just to conclude what I'm saying here, the idea that the family has the right to get in the way of the school education, this has been coming up and clearly supported by some entities in Brazil, the idea of removing the freedom at school. So a child goes through the door of the school, goes into the public territory, and has the right to be another person, of living other experiences and not those of the family. So the school has autonomy, the family does too. This is seen in the legislation. And I'd just like to say that this explains these movements as a school without a party, and the gender, and in Spanish speaking countries, they also have other variations. And first of all, they want to remove from the school certain important topics. So in terms of what we're talking about gender and sexuality. But we already have in Brazil movements of mothers and fathers and families that notice that diversity at school is important. So these same groups that want to remove these gender issues are the same groups that attack the Afro-American and Afro-Indigenous people at school. They want to remove them from the school. So definitely over the last few years, it has reached some other issues, and this is definitely still very complicated. So I am embarrassed of the city that I live in. Porto Alegre has had several forums, world forums, and they prohibited the use of the neutral language in the schools. So I belong to a group where we stimulate teachers and school communities to use a language that is more inclusive. So I prefer to call it an inclusive language, but here they talked about a neutral language. But now in the city, we have a law that prohibits this. But this prohibition is not going to stop some students still calling themselves that way. So these are the issues that I wanted to talk about.
Muito obrigada, Fernando. São tantos
Thank you very much, Fernando. We have so many challenges
o Brasil tem vivido
and so many things that Brazil has gone through in terms of going back in time, right? And
a minha e
also
pelo básico do básico.
so such basic things, that
Eu luto
and human issues, like going to the bathroom that I want to go to. So that is crazy. And, that's all I want. And I'm just fighting for the basics. And now we're going to have Jasmine Roy.
Ouais, je vais revenir, merci. Je vais revenir sur
Hello, thank you.
les grands défis qu'on a eu à rencontrer.
I would like to talk about the great challenge that we had. It's been 12 years that we've existed. In the beginning, we had systemic problems and we had to find systemic solutions. And I have to say that we are privileged here in Quebec because definitely we have been following up our children, and children are explaining this reality, and we have problems with resources. And these are problems that were set from the beginning. Since 2012, there's been research about the schools showing that 80% of the professors did not have any initial education, continuous education. And when we're talking about education, there's a whole process, especially in terms of gender identity. This can change, and in certain cases, people can even change their sexual orientation in their lives. And it's not necessarily something fixed for everyone. It could be very fluid. So it's very difficult to understand. For a man or a woman who live in a binary manner, there's a whole spectrum between them. And what we see is a lack of education. So there are many places that tell us we need help, we need information, and there's lack of financial investment and coherence in the education because there's a lot of ideologies, and frequently we have the same acronym and we form a community. We don't have the same needs, and we don't necessarily have the same way of looking at things. And with young people, when we talk about gender and gender expression, that's part of the generation. We have to support them in this. And the great difficulty is mainly to remember the obligations of the government and the laws. And implementing a law when you have violence and intimidation in the school, followed by an action plan that is evaluated, and it should be renewed after public consultations. And in this action plan, we talk about transphobia, homophobia, all kinds, and we also have to look at the discriminations in the LGBT community, because there can be people who have prejudice against trans. I have some trans friends, and the worst aggressions they suffered were in terms of homosexuals. So what is difficult today is follow-up, especially in terms of secondary school. So in primary school, we are adopting some issues, even in sexuality. I think it's bizarre to talk about sexuality, but talking about the courses of sexuality, especially human relations and sexuality. And we put the basis in infancy, but it's easier in in primary school, because people always have the same classes. You develop the emotional competencies of the children. So in secondary school, I think it's the same thing with you. And we had problems with adults more than children, and adults don't really want to mix, and they expect proposals. And I don't see this frequently. I don't want to understand, and there's no intervention. It's not only intervening when things go wrong. So there's a behavior that I talked about here. I'm going to show you what good behavior is. And then we have the testimonials as well about this wrong behavior. So the victim has to be supported so that it can become something positive, and the whole integrated system. We worked a lot on this. We have many in the organization, and the government did this. Why? Because we had a first minister who decided to take this on strongly, and he definitely worked on a great forum about violence at school. And at this point, this basically, what we see is a problem in terms of trans. Why? Because increasingly we see people expressing themselves since primary school, even before going into school. And there's a lack of resources, and this tells me, when my tennis shoe is going to grow. So definitely they don't know how to do it. And we always have to hit people over the head, saying that they have to be educated. We can't educate everyone. That's what we do in the foundation. We find multipliers, and you have to have the law, obligation, and the violence that are a shared responsibility. So it's not only the school, and you have some committees against violence and intimidation, and we find the family members, the police, the relatives, the parents, the teachers, everybody in the community. It could be in the healthcare system, to ensure them of the support of these when they have problems, of these children when they have problems, and being able to multiply the initiatives and the action plans. And this is where we are currently.
Muito obrigada pela contribuição.
Thank you very much.
Para seguir o nosso papo. Mais uma vez, agradecer a todos
And
que estão assistindo. Compartilhe essa conversa e para os amigos.
if we look at the people who are included in this debate, and we have to definitely talk about it to more people. So why do you believe that it's still a huge taboo to talk about LGBT rights in the schools? So today, people are, it's something natural. And I'm going to invite Jasmine Roy to talk again.
J'aurais pas grand-chose à dire à ce niveau-là, parce que nous, on a fait un grand sondage en 2017. 80%
So
des Canadiens étaient
in the agenda of 2017, 80% of Canadians wanted to invest money in the fight against homophobia and transphobia. So we are privileged, and especially for white men who are homosexual, and it's good, things are good, and for white women too, but we find the problems when we look at the trans reality. I think that the trans people, they live what we lived in the 80s and 90s, where they said, okay, you're going to school, because we were marked as to recruit at school. So we were recruiting how to go into a homosexual sect. And they showed that that's not how it works. It's basically the same thing with trans people. So the trans, we understand that we really don't know about this reality. We talk about trans people, but we also we also talk about homosexuals. In 2017, in the picture of generations, the parents support their kids a lot more and they fight for their children. The child has rights. There's the obligation of going to school and guaranteeing their safety there. Of course, we have problems when we talk about this sort of thing. And especially the people who have to do with religion or migration, and frequently to put this into a context. And they think that it works like this, and then we go back to the right and how the law should be applied at school. And the schools say, well, I have to apply the laws of our society at school, and I apply them for each. And if we can, the parents know that this has to be present, and you can have several reasonings, and people have to have access to reality and to be able to have access to this information. And that's what we understood in terms of when we look at the school, and if it does a good job, we look at the next generation, then 50% of homophobia, there's a decline of 50% of homophobia. So that was measured in Quebec. So the school has more power when we talk about educational measures, when we talk about going back to providing the school with this power. That's what I see about this. Very important. Thank you very much. André Rivas? Well, the questions that you've asked, definitely they are very important. And, it's a whole study here. I'm going to share my opinion, but I think that first of all, it is a taboo to talk about integrated education. So what is integrated sexual education? I think, it's a human right. And we're talking about adults and the educational entities and those from other states. They are structured with a patriarchal system. And if we have access to this in terms of integrated sexual identity for everyone in equal conditions, of course, what happens is that the patriarchal or oppressive system that is oppressing all the time, it completely excludes certain people amongst those that exclude the most. There are the people from this group, and during childhood, the children as well. And people from some geographical places, and it's a whole system, right? In terms of violence, institutional violence, and that's where our patriarchal system is. And it also talks about the sexual orientation of young people. That's why in Argentina, we have a high rate of pregnancy in our region, and pregnancy of girls that are 15 or 14 years of age, 13 years of age, and so on. So there's no integrated sexual education. And this is not done because definitely there's a whole system of violence that is being supported. So basically, what we should continue working with, we have to understand that integrated sexual education, what is it? It's a right. It is taken to humans, in terms of information. It makes us free or autonomous or better people with regard to our decisions and accessing our rights. And it is going to provide us with greater potential and not the opposite. But it's not by chance that this is stopped, because this system is an oppressive system that will benefit certain situations, certain power situations. And it's really very separating. So we have to be aware of these things. And we have to fight for these human rights and lose our fear of doing that. So when we talk about a taboo, everyone who is listening to us, when we can talk about it. As I said before, those who have gender, this is at school or in childhood, any of those can be a problem. And that includes violence and exclusion and, well, a long time. So this allows us to support, to provide support. And this is the story of life. I understand that we have to see, it has to be a system to change this, but until now, we can't really say, okay, we have to know about the changes that we're going to make now in our communities. We have a great power of influence, so we can't really remain as spectators, only watching or just make this something natural. No, we have to do something about it. It's fundamental to start talking. Each of us have to get information and get empowered, and we have to decide on the communities to be able to take this information forward and these changes to changes so that integral education will be a human right, and that's a reality in our communities. So thank you very much.
Muito obrigada pela sua contribuição.
Thank you for your contribution. And now I'd like to invite Fernando to also answer this question. Fernando. Thank you. I would like to start, for me, the fact that it still produces so much difficulties in the Brazilian case. First of all, it has to do with following the strategy, that had already been followed. So basically in the LGBT movement, the movement of races here in Brazil and indigenous population, it placed its demands under an umbrella of human rights. And this country, Brazil, is a country that has a presidency that is against human rights. And since the federal constitution of 1988, and the one that placed President Dilma in power, we had an advance in diversity and in human diversity. So now we are moving backwards. The second issue is that it has become very clear in Brazil, at least for many people, that the issues of gender and sexuality, they structure the society. So it's not only issues of customs. So, if a person decides to be called by a certain name, decides to live their love for somebody in the same sex. So these are not smaller issues. Unfortunately, even between the progressive forces, the left wing in Brazil, there are still some people who consider the fights of gender and race and sexuality as smaller issues, but these people are becoming smaller in number. And another point that also shows the importance of presenting the um, identity of the groups as human rights. It was the need of the current government of changing the name of the Ministry of Human Rights and giving it the name of the Ministry of Women and the Family and Human Rights. We've never had a family ministry. Nowadays, we have legislations that talk about governmental programs of strong families, how to improve families. The family has become something like a company to fight against the rights of the LGBT QA plus population. And we have advances over here. And I'd like to say that we need to look at the size of the Brazilian population. At this point, we're here at 3 in the afternoon in Brazil of a Tuesday, and the number of students in Brazilian schools is 48 million. So according to the data, 48 million people are in school and at the end of secondary school. So basically, we're talking about we're excluding secondary school, and we have the schools in Brazil, and it seems that gender and sexuality started to access a great population of teenagers. And I'd like to say that out of the pedagogic activities in the world I work in, this produces, well, one of those who have been producing the most. It involves the other countries here, the countries that are here with us. And we have that classic image on the screen, which is the President of the Republic and the ministers. So the ones that come in on the first day. So they change all the time. And then, it becomes a little outdated. But we would like to look at the picture and the day of the start of the mandate and the ministers. And we compare with, for example, a picture of the Prime Minister of Canada, of the ministry that has white women and other ethnics, and with the image of the new president of Chile and then Argentina, and also in the government of Colombia. And it has also some kind of gender aspect. And after this is discussed when we talk about the importance of the issue. So when we talk about the race and the indigenous population, and in terms of the presidents and the ministers, and we have the issue of rights and sexuality, which is not the best thing. So I'd like to close with my example, showing that for the young populations, it becomes very clear that the idea of sexuality and gender issues, definitely this is part of the political life. It's not just something individual. So if I decide to change my name, this is human rights and dignity, and it has to do with the rights of other people as well. So this phenomenon of uh, politicization of these issues in
para futuras mudanças de governo. Era isso, gente.
that has to be part, shouldn't change when we change the government. Thank you. That was brilliant. And I would like to invite Victor Rocha now to make his contribution. Thank you. I was listening to all of the experience and everything that was happening in Canada and China and what Fernando was saying. Although we don't have everything that we wanted, I think that, the focus is there. And when we talk about development and we can develop better work, and from this work, we have the support. According to what I've already said, so the students feel that with diversity, so it's not only the girls or boys, there are young people who don't feel safe at school, and they have to talk about different positionings, and they also have to talk about sexual education. So I think that it should be the change, something that we don't have. And the school should be a safe place. So to generate support for our children. And they don't see this as a way of getting support, a place where they would get support. So what Fernando was saying, in fact, in terms of what we have, there are certain forms of opening. On the one hand, we came from government that dealt with this problem. And then we also talk about the educational centers trying to incorporate this. And then on the following year, this happened because there was no support or there was no policies that were systematic. So basically, we work on the needs and the scarcity of the policies. And although the processes are still there, it is important to generate this so that it is within the context of providing support to the communities. And we also have signs with regard to the places, the development, and the experience. And on the other hand, the schools, suffers the effects of how society faces certain authoritarian views and more conservative views, and it does not really impact our population. And sometimes we have positionings, traditional positioning, and this also involves many of our children, and maybe they won't have the possibility of being autonomous, and for children to be able to get nominated and to be called and involving this space for them to be able to be part of this and to have support in this process. And many times what happens is that there are some schools that are more open depending on their educational projects. And many times these schools recognize the needs, and On the other hand, this is not generated, and also the institutionalization of these practices. And we really have to look at the integrated association and those that are against this. So, and definitely there should be some sort of recognition or support of the material to be able to protect the rights of boys and girls, and they should be able to identify themselves and not just hide it. So this involves a public policy that has to be effective with regard to this sort of thing. And there should be this basis to be able to get to their own path. And they should also have opportunities, also transforming the school into a safe place and a place that contains, that has, and that involves concrete action, not only a discourse, the need to recognize these rights and recognize their importance, and also in practice. And finally, they go through without being incorporated, and this also has to do with working with the families and the educational entities should have a greater potential. So I'm going to ask you to close because we have to continue. Yes, so I also believe that it has to do with the teachers, and many times the teachers, they also don't feel that they are in the educational spaces and that they can make a change. So they also feel, let's say, they have to go back to the educational area. So they're going to go through an issue that is not only going through this, but it's something the teachers have to go through as well. Yes, Leandro. Thank you, guys. So sorry, the time is very, very tough to manage the timing here. So I'm going to raise my hand like this, okay, when your time is almost up. Okay, so please pay attention to this little hand. Otherwise, we're not going to stick to the right timing. Okay, so when we talk about the number of transgenic children, that is something really scary. So how can schools work together with the parents or family members to help in the welcoming and acceptance of these children? So Victor, please.
Gracias, Leandra. Y así que voy a esperar la manito o no, me voy a
Thank you,
adelantar.
Leandra. And I'm going to pay attention to the hand that you're going to raise. Now, I have a question that hurts a lot. It's a question that talks about urgency. And I think that with the pandemic, so definitely this is something that we were working on, and we've been working on the rights. And we know that it's dramatic and how dramatic it is. So considering this, what the pandemic did, and the pandemic made these problems not be accepted by the communities. So we have to work with them. So there was a lot of delay. And finally, I'm going to talk about the need to, we work with the parents as well, not only with the children, and many of them, actually are authors of resistance, and basically we have to talk about education. And I think that we should increase it more. And this is direct work. And it's more with regard to the parents of the families, and especially in the transversal manner with the students and the young boys and girls, and they're all part of this situation, and their relationships with boys and girls, and the increase not only in what we have socially, but the experience involving these identities as well, the need of generating permanent work for the families with other players in the community as well. So it's not only related to the teachers, and there's also the student. And we also have to look at the communities, and also looking at what was generated, and for example, the communities in Buenos Aires, in the countryside of Argentina, and getting support and things that have to do with identifying, and as we identify these support networks, we also have to involve the families. So considering this situation, we also act in a way, and we also have to look at the family and to be able to see how serious it is. And I think that's also important to say that the families should be incorporated in this, and they should be part of the follow-up and the support in these situations. Okay, I'm really, really happy that this little hand worked. So the next speaker will be Andre Rivas, please.
Bueno, muchas gracias.
Well, thank you very much.
Tomando la sintonía de lo que decía Víctor,
Let us continue in the
eh,
tuning here. I think that over here, we should put the paradigm of human rights in
haga que las
schools
personas que van a estudiar puedan
so that the people who are going to
seguros.
study
Y cuando hablas del
will
tema
be able to
de
find
las
themselves in a
personas
safe
que
environment.
necesitan
And when we
ayuda,
talk about
está vinculado con lo que
suicide
estábamos
in
hablando, violencia
children
sexual,
and teenagers,
seguridad,
we're talking about structural violence
públicas a las que no se
and
le asigna la suficiente cantidad de
the
recursos.
public policies, and we also designate the kind of support. So we have to work on what was said before, but we also have to work on something that is not done. And, that's for all the populations. And it definitely talks about vulnerability and mental health. And the pandemic has placed us in a situation where we have exposed the importance of what mental health is. And I have not seen this in the country. I have not seen a campaign during these 3 years that we've been going through the pandemic. We have not directed specifically we have not directed this to children who have some kind of hostility at home, some kind of vulnerability, and we don't really have resources and counseling, and there was no priority set. And I believe that this happened because we're going to have to look at how many things we have to take into account. And this is done, there's a lack of data. And when we talk about 2020, we're talking about the lack of data about the LGBT population, the data that is opened by the government, and if there is any kind of violation, and you're not going to find data directly. And so what we're doing in Argentina, we talk about the identity, and this is the first one that starts to tell us. And it's the first time that we work with mental health, and we have to bring some kind of priority. We have lost many of our people, and everybody knows student, a child or teenager that is in a situation of mental health, a very strong one, very serious one, and they have lost somebody because of that. So in fact, it is the time to definitely work on the paradigm of mental health in an integral manner at school, and so that we can also have the teachers and the whole of the community integrated, because in fact, the professors, the families working on the couple and LGBT as well, but it is really very important. So there is formation and campaigns, and definitely there are no taboos. Thank you very much for the question. So the little hand, you can close off what you're saying, okay? It's not the same instant, right, that you have to stop. Okay, so now we're going to hear Jasmine Roy. Thank you very much. Over here in Quebec, in Canada, we cannot say that the subsidies in the transgender children are going up. We have to say that what we evaluate in the foundation, the mental health problems, and we did this in 2017, and we're going to do this. We're going to see the evolution in a few years, and most of these people, they had suffering and mental suffering, and they felt they were being excluded. And this is about the non-binary realities. And I know that some researchers are studying this. So there is an underrepresentation of these people who have mental health problems, and trying to understand why this happens and at what moment as well. So we also understand, and we actually made many campaigns for this during the pandemic, and now the problem that we have is that we don't have enough psychologists to receive these trans people. This is an elephant in the room, and this can definitely bring a lot of difficulties. And this is something that has to be done. And it's very difficult because there are a few people who are specialized in this follow-up of trans people. So what the young people tell us, they don't have any ammunition because, how come the trans people don't have this kind of education? They don't know how to intervene. So basically, they become depressive. And in fact, maybe this does not regulate the mental health problem. It's much longer than that. And Globally speaking, we have a mental health problem in Canada, and that was nominated. And when we talk about young people from different gender and sex, so that's a 2/3 more risk of removing their lives. But we negotiated a lot more here in Canada with young people who have mental health problems, and they are chronic because and we have to take care of them. And it's not only the trans people in general, we're talking about the parents who have to see that their children, they have a mental health problem, and the parents still have problems to accept this reality because they feel they are to blame. So they feel they are guilty, and they have the tendency to, it's still a taboo to talk about mental health in children. And these are, saying that these are trans people. That's what I have to say. Thank you very much. And now I'd like to invite Fernando for his contribution. Thank you. This is, just like my colleagues said, a very sad issue. And in Brazil, it is really very sad. So I'm going to say it like I see it. It's something urgent. It's urgent to face not only mental health problems in the trans population, but also suicides and also the murdering of this population. And this is basically together. These things are potentialized. And in fact, it's the commitment of the school with these topics nowadays. And it seems that it is extremely important because until a few years ago, research showed that trans people, they took on this process when they were outside school, and that's not what happens today. At this point, I belong to a research group here in the South, coordinated by my colleague Maggie Hayara from the Federal University of Paraná. I work with her. And our data has been showing that in an increasing manner, this point of assuming your transgender personality, that happens during school. So school becomes more important in this sense. So talking about some alternatives now, it is important to know that the school develops inside it a network of love for these people. So affection means a relationship of respect, of perception of diversity, and it shows these people, at least in these spaces at school, that they are accepted and understood, and the topics that they bring for discussion, these are considered to be relevant as well. And our enemies are the ones that I've already placed over here. So projects like gender ideology that removes them from school, and projects that want to eliminate the use of social names, and that has already been done before. And also, and that's how I call it. And the second thing, there's a school that wanted to get integrated into a network that involves the healthcare providers and also student councils and all those entities that deal with the youth, issues of youth, and also with some organs of social service and also NGOs. So the example of Porto Alegre over here, where equality and transsexuals, they had free transit in many schools with the conversations. And we saw a great reduction in this sort of initiative. And it's different from that. So it's very difficult And it's not just something that happens once in a while. So definitely there is, somebody has a depression crisis and something is done, and we need programs, long programs. Thank you.
Muito obrigada pela contribuição, Fernando. E agora eu sigo.
And thank you very much. And we're going to our last question of our conversation. So, it's all a lesson for us, and being able to learn with this debate. So in a very hostile world in terms of LGBT, especially in Brazil, the country that kills the most of these people, and we have lots of deaths. So how can we work to strengthen these children, these LGBT children, to face the world outside? And I'm going to invite Fernando to talk about this. Sorry, I was writing down what I was going to speak. So first of all, I would like to agree with the element in the question, which is the fact that Brazil is the country that has killed the most transsexuals and LGBT. I'm going to concentrate on this population, but this is valid for the LGBT population, right? And this piece of information, it has been contested by the government. And if it does not promote research and it does not believe the data that we have. So as all three colleagues have said,
Situação em que nós temos dificuldade de gerar dados, né?
it's a situation where it is difficult to generate data. We have very little data, and the very little data that we have is not accepted as being valid.
Por exemplo, assim, a última edição do censo escolar, que é o
Let me give you a short example of what we had in a school census. So it was very poor in the sense of capturing the questionnaires from all of these 180,000 schools in Brazil, the information about violence with the LGBT population. So, gender. And we have in Brazil, we have talked about the National Association of Transsexuals, and there's a lot of research being done, and I've been participating in one with several colleagues, and they have been raising these elements. And we also have a big problem, which was the suspension for a long time of the national encounter promoted by the governments before of the LGBTQA plus population, with the presence of ministers of the state and from all of the states and provinces. And so we have all of this. And how do you do this? The Brazilian case, it is just very difficult. And I have to say that, things change with a change of government. We're not able to deal with this adequately, but the construction of these support networks and, this has revealed itself to be something important. And at least the partnership with the schools and the universe that we have here in Porto Alegre in the metropolitan region, it is positive. So most of the schools, they see this in a good way. And this is something that is part of the government initiatives. And it's definitely something that is difficult, very difficult here in Brazil. It is a situation of almost extermination. Thank you. As a trans, it's very painful. As Fernando said, that's our reality. And, trans people, in terms of safety, yeah, it really hurts my body
Agora
too.
é a hora para fazer sua contribuição, Victor Rocha.
So now I would invite Victor for his contribution.
Gracias, Leandra.
Thank you, Leandra.
Me voy a quedar
And
con la segunda parte de la pregunta, con el segundo, porque una pregunta bien,
I am going to
interesante
stick to
era
the second part of the question because it's a
cómo
very
poder
interesting
pensar a través de
question.
la comunidad docente,
And
específicamente del ejercicio docente, ¿cierto?
it's
Yo
interesting
creo
to
que
see
es
how we
necesario, sobre todo
observe
en la etapa de
the
visibilización
teachers,
de
right?
la
That's
temática, ¿cierto?
important.
Porque
So,
quería,
we talk
como bien
about
decía,
stabilizing
era
this. And
darle la
I was saying, Andrea, I was talking about the need to provide this urgency in the structural violence as well. And this also goes through transformations, and it talks about, we also talk about this space, but this is something that we have to be aware of. And, other identities should be circulating, and the school should be a place for proliferation of different entities and experiences, because this involves substantial change in the school. And in this place, we're going to be able to have more positive identities that, the school is the place that should contribute to these new identities. And the school should be the place to accept these identities. And inside the educational practice, I see our families, and they are more conscious that they about this process. And besides working with violence and hate, they generated processes, cultural processes of positive experiences, the LGBT, QA plus. So this helped us in the television series when we talk about love and affection. And many times this is missing. And the school also misses this effectiveness and love. And considering this reality where our own identities, they talk about violence and death, I think that we have to transform this school into a safe place of love and civilization and other aspects. And in this way, make these processes, so that the children don't feel alone. And this is also the individual or collective practices inside the school, but they should follow a policy, and it should be something sustainable. And the professors and the LGBT QA plus, they do this work, but sometimes we don't feel accepted by the communities. So also the support networks inside the community, and thinking about the development of these entities, that also shows looking at the school, with another focus. As Fernando was saying, the transition process nowadays that we see in the school, this is the space that we have to be able to support and politicize this construction and generate tools to be able to face this that is very complex, and especially for the children, the LGBT children, QA plus children.
Muito obrigada pela contribuição.
Thank you very much for your contribution,
Agora, Jasmine
Victor. And now, Jasmine Roy.
Moi, premièrement, je suis très attristé là, d'entendre
So
ce qui se passe dans
I am
votre
very
pays.
sad to hear what is happening in your country.
Privilégié parce
I
que
feel a little
j'ai
bit
participé beaucoup
privileged
depuis que
because,
j'étais jeune. C'est pour ça que j'ai lancé ma fondation aussi à un moment donné,
and
parce que j'ai vécu beaucoup
that's why I
de
created
quand
the
j'étais jeune.
foundation.
Aujourd'hui, on
And
parle
I saw a lot of this when I was young.
Québec.
And we talk about
Je veux
this in our schools in
regarder un
Quebec.
peu,
But I would like to
il y a eu des mouvements sociaux ici
have some
qui
hope
sont
in all of this in terms of social movements.
une
So transforming our communities. I think it's perfect. I think our problem is perfect, and it's a challenge. And I can say that today we see couples of boys and couples of girls that, they're not rejected anymore. They have friends. They hold hands, and we can openly affect the identity of gender. It's not perfect, but it was impossible a while ago to have what we have at school today. So also in terms of adults, we mobilized. It's part of the society, and definitely if we kill a trans person, we are, maybe killing the next Nobel Prize. It's a wealth that we have. And, how are we going to be able to coexist with this? And the more we do that, the more we'll benefit from it. So what we understand as well, I think it's a pity, but it's not only something that the right-wing government has in Canada. It's not, something that they should take up the power or not. We are a community. We are everywhere in the world. And I always say that LGBT does not have any borders. So we're together everywhere. We see people suffering. That's always something that is painful. We're working on changing the situation, and in the places where we have a lot of violence, it's important for the government to take on its place. And for action plans, it's interesting to have will of the adults, not only from LGBT, but with all the children who have parents. And I've seen lots of children telling me, oh, so my parents we were always against homosexuals, but when I said I was a homosexual, they never rejected me because, it was their kid. So love is very strong. And if we continue to mobilize the parents and the children, and their children will not be banned from having access to education. So maybe then the parents will be more mobilized, because I don't know any father or mother who wants their children to suffer. And I see this in Quebec, and I hope this is going to have hope, and we're going to fight for the children in school. And my child is trans. I accept it now. I follow him, and he has the right to go to school and be safe. Thank you. Oh, guys, yeah, it's really a big discrepancy. And, Fernando was listening to this, and, it's the same face that I had. And it's a program, and the violence sometimes comes from the family. So it's the rights, and, it's completely, the opposite. They have parents who work with LGBTs, that know LGBTs. When the children do that, it's the parents that are against it. It's the parents that are aggressive towards them. It's the mothers that kill their children, right? It's crazy. Yeah, that's horrible. I have goosebumps here. So next time, do not place me as a mediator, please. Put me as a guest to speak. So I'd like to close this panel. It is a great honor. It's a real honor. It's a great pleasure to come out of here. I'm out of here feeling much bigger and with a lot more knowledge. Thank you, Jasmine Roy, Andrea Rivas, Victor Rocha, Fernando Sefner. And I'm going to ask you to make your final comments so that we can close our event. Thank you very much. So I'm going to call Fernando for his final remarks. I would like to thank those who are listening to us. I'd like to thank Jasmine, Victor, and Andre. And my final message is very optimistic, although I'm in a country with Leandra, where it's very difficult. And I'd like to collect some phrases that were said by some of my colleagues. For school to be seen as a safe place to be, and going to school can be something that can be done with pleasure and happiness to, going through that gate, and that will be something good. And I'd also like to insist on love, which is a topic that appeared now. And I'd like to talk about love, according to what Paulo Freire said, the idea that love at school is the possibility of learning together, of designing a project in the future that has the happiness, as Paulo Freire says. And finally, I'd like to say that diversity cannot be seen at school as a luxury. It has to be seen as a cognitive issue. So noticing that the world is diverse, it means all of us become more intelligent and also more effective. So these are my messages. Thank you.
Muito obrigada, Fernando.
Thank you, Fernando. Now let's go to Victor Horsham. So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation for this moment. It's always very important to fill in the spaces with these conversations, especially because of the urgency. And to continue reflecting, because sometimes, how can we work on this and how can we be part of this change? So the school can be part of this change, and that's because the teachers, this work, this is a challenge that we have to be able to make schools safer and to be able to have a contention space and to be able to support our youth in this construction of experiences. And nowadays, the school becomes the more important space for children, especially in Latin America, where you have not only access to social support, but also affection and what we were saying, affection is revolutionary. And I think that we should put this in evolution and the construction of these aspects together with our children and the school in the space where we should learn to build this space. So the school is the ideal space to work on diversity, to work on this relationship together with others. And we continue to have challenges, definitely, and we're going to continue moving forward. But most of what we're going to do and most of what you're doing in your communities, I think it is mobilization. And the more we get involved in this mobilization, the more aware we are in the role that we're complying with as teachers. I think that we'll be able to generate not only the policies that are important, because these are urgent needs, they are situations that are urgent, but they will become part of our own concern in our path inside the schools. So thank you for the invitation and kisses to everyone. Thank you very much, Victor. And now I would like to invite Andrea Rivas.
Bueno, muchas gracias.
Well, thank you very much. I would like to thank you for the invitation. For me, it's an honor to share this moment with you. And I would like to thank all those who make up these panels, the organizers, and to close as a reflection. When we talk about complying with international obligations and about human rights and about citizens, I am a person that believes in the communities. And in this case, We're talking about working on empowerment and autonomy of our young people. So we have a Latin American culture. The adults, they occupy their spaces, and they're talking about these places should be occupied by our children, and this revolutionary and international dialogue with everyone is important. That's why I think it's very good to work on the community autonomy, the schools autonomy, so that the children can become leading roles and they can conduct this, because the way that we see this, as Victor and Fernando have already said, they're going to only receive this. I think this is something that is not according to human rights. So I think that while the states are setting their priorities in order, I believe in the basis. So it's the basis of the educational community that is democratic and plural, and there is liberty, there's freedom, and it should guarantee the autonomy. And we're going to continue working on this. And thank you very much, so that this can be done in this way. And thank you once again, the Embassy of Canada in Argentina, so that made it possible for us to have a very impactful project that collaborated with the institution of these rights that help most of the integration so that it can be done inside the communities. Thank you very much. And one last thing, don't forget that whenever you have a hate speech, there is a situation with regard to children and teenagers or somebody that an LGBT, it is part of the training. So work to be able to create the situation. Thank you very much, André Rivas. And now let's hear Jasmine Roy. Well, I'm going to be very brief. Thank you everyone for participating in this exchange. And I think that basically I have the impression that we are winning this. Sometimes I feel that we are moving backwards, and we had a trans girl who committed suicide here in Canada. And I believe that if we continue with this and we document it and we mobilize whoever is here, and that helped to pass on the message. Maybe you're not part of LGBT, but we're your friends. We are, well, we want you to take the word and make our rights be heard, because, all of our rights are acquired, and we work on social equality, which is another challenge, because the laws, the way you see them, we can have laws, but we have to apply them as well. So I just wanted to, in this International Day of Fighting Against Homophobia, I'd like to have the courage to say, yes, we have challenges, but yes, we're going to be able to beat them. So thank you, everyone. Brilliant, brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. And tomorrow at 10 a.m. Brasilia time, we'll be back with the second forum of LGBTQA2+ to talk about the world. And there's no doubt that you should not miss it. Thank you very much, and see you next time. Kisses.